My name is Chris Hamilton. I am the Equity Officer at Lake-Sumter State College. I serve as chair of the Equity and Diversity Committee and, of course, the Equity and Diversity Advisory Committee. Yes, we have two committees, one staffed by college staff and the other by members of the community. In this capacity, I welcome you to our Hispanic American Month program that has a special focus this year. So you might ask, what is this special focus? Well, the state of Florida is celebrating 500 years of Spanish history and culture with the statewide VIVA Florida 500 initiative. This initiative is sponsored by Florida Department of State. Several events have been held or taken place over the past months, and more scheduled throughout 2013. Funding for this event has been provided by a grant from the Florida Humanities Council, supported by funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities in support of a series of programs during this commemorative year. Today, we are delighted to have this opportunity to focus on the history of our service district, the College's service district, which encompasses Lake and Sumter counties and the areas placed in Spanish Colonial Florida. Of course, I'm a native Lake-County and have resided in Okahumpka, Florida. Who knows where Okahumpka might be? If you want to Okahumpka, Florida for the past 60+ years. And only recently learned of the area's importance during the late Spanish and early U.S. territorial time period. It is my limited understanding that Central Florida was vital to the survival of the Spanish coastal communities. Some factors critical to the awareness of the history of the Spanish communities include almost the entire Spanish population was removed by 1842. No physical ruins have been discovered or remain of Spanish origin. The wooden frame plantation homes of Seminoles have long vanished. Only architectural fragments provide evidence of the African maroon communities which wanted to remain undiscovered. Most written documents from the area were in Spanish and consigned to obscure depositories. However, the advent of our famous internet has provided new opportunities for research, which resources the Florida Memory Project by the Palm Library, the archives of the Indies, and numerous other resources that can be easily and quickly accessed. Thus, the voices of the diverse people of the Spanish Florida can be heard and their unbiased stories can be told. One of the scholars who has worked diligently to bring these voices to the present is with us today. This person is in the person of Dr. Susan Richburg Parker, who comes with impeccable credentials. Dr. Parker is a noted scholar, author, and educator. She has appeared on the Arts and Entertainment Network's biography series, Univision, and the Public Broadcasting System. She is the author of numerous works focusing on Spanish colonial Florida. Dr. Parker has been a project historian and served on multiple boards, including the advisory board of the Florida Studies Center at the University of South Florida, president and board member of the St. Augustine Historical Society, and the Fort Mosaic Board of Directors. She has received several honors and awards recognizing her contribution to Florida's history. Please join me in welcoming the Executive Director of the St. Augustine Historical Society, Dr. Susan Richburg Parker. Thank you.
All right. Hi, and I'm very glad to be here this afternoon. I am the director of the St. Augustine Historical Society, And I live in St. Augustine, therefore, and I was telling someone when I got up this morning before I got into the car, I saw the Atlantic Ocean, and then headed this way, went across the St. John's, and of course seen the numerous lakes in this area since I've been here. I appreciate your introduction very much, and I do want to make the, since you brought out some of the sources that I use and other people do for research in Spanish Florida. Yes, the Archives of the Indies in Seville, Spain are online. It's a bit cumbersome to use, but it's possible. However, a lot of the research that I've used that are in Spanish documents that I'm going to talk about today actually are in the Library of Congress from a series, a collection called the East Florida Papers, and they are not yet online. They have not digitized them, so I've used them on microfilm. And actually I did a great deal of my research in microfilm before it was available on the internet. One other thing about documents, which any of you haven't used any old ones or if you've used microfilm in the past, a number of the documents that I used on microfilm, they were hardly legible. You would look and you'd try to see the blurring, and you'd stand this way in the microfilm reader, and you'd stand that way to see if you could even pick up what something was. Well, microfilm itself is very self-destructive. It has a high acid content. And so I've learned over time that some of the sources that I used that were microfilm, actually the original documents that were filmed are still in very good shape. And when they've put them under digital scanners, of course now they're in color as well, not just in black and white, but the resolution is much better. They're actually legible again, whereas all along my issues were with the microfilm and not actually with the old documents, so that's been a real nice surprise too. Before I start, I want to mention another program that's coming up by the Florida Humanities Council, and I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with the Florida Humanities Council because they sponsor things all over Florida and certainly provide speakers that many small historical societies and other organizations probably could not afford to bring in on their own. Stipends from the Florida Humanities Council and provides that. But the St. Augustine Historical Society will be sponsoring this program not this coming Friday, but Friday the 11th and 12th for the History of Florida. This book is being released by the University of Florida Press next week. I think it's scheduled for the 7th or the 8th of October. And it is a book that deals with Florida's history from prehistory through, I don't know, probably 1990, 2000, something like that. It is a follow-up of the history book that was produced by the University of Florida Press in 1996 with many of the same authors. And as you can see, I don't know how well you can see this, it may not have been good enough resolution for this large screen, but we're going to have about 15 authors in St. Augustine to discuss their chapters and then talk with each other. So if any of you can make it up there for any of that time, I really welcome you to do so. It will be October 11th in the afternoon, which is Friday, and then all day on the 12th, and it too is sponsored by the Florida Humanities Council and a number of other agencies as well. And if you'd like to have books signed, we'll have 15 of the 20-odd authors in the book there, and actually a few of the authors are deceased, so obviously they couldn't be there. Well, I don't know how else to say that. But I think what I want to do today is, in fact I know what I want to do today is, as we're here close to Okahumpka, as you said, or Okahumpka, as it appears in the 1836 map with an I and a Y instead of two A's. I want to give you a little background about the Native Americans in Florida, not just the people in Okahumpka. So I think what I would kind of call this might be the prequel to the Seminole Wars and the actions that took place in this area. And I wasn't going to do the talk this way maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago when I thought about it, but I gave a talk last week at another Florida Humanities Council gathering, and one of them said, well, something about the Seminoles, who were the first Indians in Florida, and I thought, no, they were not the first Native Americans. They were not the first group living in Florida, and a lot of people don't know that. So most of you know that, then I'm just repeating what you already know, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I think we'll move ahead with that. One of the interesting things about Florida and the peninsula of Florida is that it's the place in the United States where Native Americans and Europeans have interacted and Africans had interacted for over the longest period of time. This is where the first landings were, the first treks by such as Narvaez and DeSoto, and so the Europeans and the Native Americans have been interacting with each other in the Florida Peninsula, longer than they had in other areas. And of course, in this area was where one of the first, although brief, interactions took place. As I mentioned, the trek by Pancho de Narvaez, and then 11 years later, in 1539, Bernardo de Soto. This is a general map of what is believed to be the DeSoto route through Florida. Appears in one of Jerry Milanich's books. As they trek through, of course, they make some comments about the Native Americans. Much of our information about the Native Americans on the DeSoto trek is part of a literary offering, and so sometimes it's a little more perhaps lyrical than perhaps historic, but it is what we have. Jerry Milanich has noted that most of the native groups in this area were listed by their village names, so we don't have any sort of overarching organization, and perhaps there wasn't any overarching organization in the 1530s when they came through. They're largely just mentioned by the village names as they walk through. It is believed that, and you all may know this better than I, it is believed that some of DeSoto's scouts reached the area near Dade City, and just as they would later on in DeSoto's trek throughout the southeast, of course they unwittingly left some of their bacteria and pathogens in their wake. The diseases, no doubt, were devastating, as they were to most Native Americans, and it killed huge numbers of people. Interesting, we talk a lot about the number of Native Americans that were killed by interaction with Europeans, and that is correct. But I think sometimes we overlook the fact that in the 1500s, and especially in the 1600s, epidemics were everywhere. They were killing huge numbers of people. Among the Native Americans, although they've done a lot of damage by the 1600s, among the Native Americans in Europe and in the Americas. So there were people succumbing to disease everywhere. And let me just give you a little bit of the idea of, other than the Indian population, the numbers that we hear reports about how many people were dying. Of course, you can imagine from the 1600s, the data is very shaky. I think we need to call it sometimes data. Sort of gives us an idea that it's more scientifically collected than it was. But they say that, for example, an epidemic that took place in 3 years between 1614 and 1617 killed half of the mission Indians, living near St. Augustine. But it wasn't just in the New World that this was happening. Over a 20-year period in Spain, it was reported that epidemics killed 1/10 of the population of Castile and 1/5 of the people that lived in Valencia and Mallorca, and as much perhaps as 1/2 of the people living in some of the Spanish cities in the middle of the 1600s. Whether these are exaggerated or not, or that's how it seemed to the people that were there at the time, that half the people they knew had died, nevertheless, it was obviously huge numbers. So epidemics were truly pandemics. They were everywhere at the time. So as you know, Menendez and Narvaez stomped through the western part of Florida, but they don't make any settlement. I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that Menendez did winter in the area of Tallahassee, had a winter camp there, but did not establish a settlement. And for a number of ventures, the Spanish were interested in settling the Gulf Coast. They turned their attention towards the Gulf Coast, Narvaez, DeSoto, of course, Pensacola, and that's where they thought it would be more beneficial than the Atlantic coast. However, they do, as we know, turn their attention back towards the Atlantic coast in 1564 when they find out that the French have established a settlement in what is today Jacksonville. They've established a settlement in Spanish claimed territory, and they can't tolerate it, to be truthful. Pedro Menendez already had plans to try to settle the east coast or the Atlantic coast of North America, to put in a settlement and ideally raise all the things that could be raised at the same latitude in Spain. This was the idea at the time. If you can raise it at 30 degrees latitude in Spain, you can raise it in the Americas, and 40 and 40. So he was going to raise olives. Well, olives don't do well along the Atlantic coast. silk, all sorts of other things, sheep, all sorts of other things that did well in Spain, they found out did not do well in the Americas. But I bring this up because this was in his plan already before the Spanish had heard about the French in the area of Jacksonville. He'd been talking to the King of Spain, trying to get sponsorship, and sponsorship, of course, means money. So he had a plan to settle along the Atlantic coast of North America, and he wanted to settle in the area of what is today Parris Island, South Carolina. That was the ideal latitude at the time to make his settlement. That's where he was headed. They called it Santa Elena at the time. Today we call it Beaufort, Parris Island, Port Royal. There's various names that it goes by. But when the Spanish found out that the French had established Fort Caroline in Jacksonville, this King of Spain told Menendez, first you've got to get rid of the French that are in Spanish territory, and then you can go on with your settlement. So by default, he lands at St. Augustine. It's the next harbor to the south. I live very close to it. It's not a good harbor. But that's where he lands, and this is an excellent case of temporary becomes permanent. He settled in St. Augustine, never intending to stay at St. Augustine, but he did, and as many of you know, we'll be having our 450th anniversary in 2 years, despite the fact that it has not a good harbor and sandy soil. We've, by hook or by crook, have managed to hang on there. And so Menendez puts his settlement there, and of course, the Spanish start to have interactions with the Native Americans. And as you start to read the reports of the Spanish, you can see already that their interaction with the natives are actually starting to change a little bit, the way the natives live, as they start to describe their clothing, as they talk about some of the implements that they brought from them, especially sharp metal tools, so that even though they think they're describing the natives as they found them, almost on a daily basis, they're actually changing the way they live. This is a map of generally most of the natives of the southeast. You can see it's dated in the 1680s. The Timucua, of course, were the ones that were near St. Augustine. The Appalachia over near Tallahassee. The Tocobaga is what they have written in this area. I think I don't know how organized the Native Americans of this area were. I don't think nearly as much as the Appalachia and the Timucua. The Ais down around Vero Beach, the Tequesta, of course, down in Miami, the Calusa, who were extremely powerful for a very long period of time, and we do find evidence of actually people, the Ais on over there in the Cape Canaveral area, finding goods from shipwrecks and things such as that, and actually sending them over to the Calusa along the west coast, sort of as a tribute. The Calusa were very powerful. And then, of course, other groups to the north, especially the Oconee, who you see there in the middle of what is today Georgia, who will be prominent in becoming the Seminole people of the Seminole Nation. The Spanish lived closely, of course, with the Timucua around St. Augustine, and then they moved north into the area, which there's no name on the map right there, the Wale, G-U-A-L-E, who were largely along the Golden Isles of Georgia. And then they moved into Tallahassee with their missions around 1608. The Spanish, as you probably know, put a lot of missions in the area, to the west to Tallahassee and up to around, today around what is around St. Catherine's Island today. They had missions both to the west and to the north. They tried a little to put missions down among the Ais and some were along the St. Johns River, but those were usually short-lived. They did not seem to be very successful with having missions of any duration in those areas. The Mission Indians, of course, continued to be exposed to the bacteria that we talked about, and the pathogens, which nobody understood at that time how diseases were passed. And a number of the Mission Indians also came to St. Augustine. So they came to do work on the projects there. They often served as bearers or carriers. In other words, rather than having mules, they had the Indians carry the items. And so they would come into St. Augustine for a period of time, a definite period of time. They were drafted by the chief of the village and said, you have a 3-month obligation to go work in St. Augustine or something such as that. Interestingly enough, we learned later that some of them preferred big city life to the mission villages, and they don't want to go back. I mean, I guess you can't keep them down in the mission after you've seen St. Augustine, you know, to use an old song. But and of course in St. Augustine there were more material goods and things such as that. So some of them liked to go back to the missions. But this gets disrupted around 1670 when the English established the colony of Carolina in Charleston. And not only have the English now established a place which is right up there where it says, you can see where it says Charlestown, right on the upper right-hand corner of the map, Stewartstown, which is about where Santa Elena, Port Royal, Paris Island is. Not only do you have English now fairly close to Spanish Florida, and a number of the Native Americans learned to play them off against each other, and they learned it very quickly, but the big impact of the English being in this southeastern region is that they hunt Indian slaves. The Spanish did not take Indian slaves in Florida. By the time the Spanish settled Florida, Indian slavery, not black slavery, but Indian slavery had been outlawed by the Spanish. Now people did it. I'm not going to say nobody did it or they held them captive, but it was not legal anymore. Indian slavery was legal in English South Carolina and was legal later in French Louisiana. It was not legal in Spanish Florida. And so the English begin to capture the natives of the Southeast, doing it similar to the way captives were taken in Africa. In other words, they use a local group and it's taken as part of warfare. They find somebody who's warring with each other, and so it's actually, generally, there's always exceptions, but the idea was that they would be taken as part of war. And the reason the Carolinians did this was, as many of the slave catchers did in Africa as well, it was for cash. They seldom, not never, but they seldom used the Native Americans as laborers on their endeavors in South Carolina. For one reason, it was too easy to run away. They knew the territory, there'd be somebody close by that could help them. So they generally captured them and sold them to other English colonies. A lot of them to Jamaica, Barbados, down in the areas where they were growing sugar, but also to New England. We know that they went to all of the various colonies that we don't usually think of as having Indian slaves, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, such as that. And so they sold them for cash to help fund the colony. They also raided down into Spanish Florida, among the Timucua, the Wally on the Georgia coast, and the Appalachia. And later on, we'll come way down into the peninsula of Florida, way far down into the peninsula, looking for slaves. By the early 1700s, Carolina Governor James Moore had persuaded the Creek Indians and some others whom they considered to be part of the Creek group to make war and capture Indians in Florida. These alliances with Europeans were often inspired by existing contentions between native groups. And of course, you can imagine they were trying to find out who was really friendly with whom and how strong the alliance was. For example, the Alabama, where we're in the area around Mobile, allied with the English, while their enemies, the Choctaw, allied with the French. So they would, the Indians would take sides. They, for the most part, I shouldn't say they had no choice, but they didn't have a lot of choice. It was probably make the best situation that you can. Between 1704 and 1706, the missions of Florida were destroyed, largely by the Carolinians and their Indian allies, and most of the Indians that had been part of the missions were killed or were captured and taken back to Carolina and subsequently sold. The numbers as to how many were captured or killed between 1704 and 1706 range anywhere truly from 400 to 4,000. It depends on whose report you read at the time. So once again, it's very hard to know. A few of the mission Indians left from the Spanish missions were able to come close to St. Augustine and stay right around St. Augustine in small little, almost like refugee camps. mixing maybe 9 people from this group and 3 from this one and 7 from this one, till you had a village of around 45 or 50. And they subsisted largely on food provided by the Spanish. They'd really been decimated, and they raised a small amount of their own food. They were fearful, as were the Spanish, to venture very far outside of town, because the Indians that had allied with the Carolinians were really lurking in the area most of the time. The history page online at the Tiki Museum website notes that the Seminoles came to prominence as allies of the English General Oglethorpe in his attack on St. Augustine in 1740. Oglethorpe was the governor for a while of Georgia and led an attack on St. Augustine against the Spanish in the 1740s. He brought his Indian allies with him, and the museum, as I said, the Seminole Tribe Indian Museum, recognizes that the Seminoles were prominent as an ally among the English that attacked St. Augustine in 1740. Afterwards, they established a settlement at Cuscowilla, which is present-day Micanopy, close to Gainesville, where they flourished as cattlemen. Their first leader, who worked with Oglethorpe, was appropriately known as Cowkeeper, and he was an Oconee, which we just saw that group name listed in the middle of Georgia. And Cowkeeper at that time was a sworn enemy of the Spanish. He was allied with the English. But in 1763, the Spanish leave North America. The war that we call the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, Great War for Empire, depends on what you call it. The treaty negotiations turned Florida over to the British, and the Spanish leave, and all of them moved to Cuba except for a few that go to Mexico. Had somebody asked me the other day, what if they didn't want them to stay? Well, they could have. The British didn't tell them they had to go, but most of them were soldiers or were part of the support group for the military in St. Augustine. So they got their orders. They really didn't have choice as to whether they stayed. And the other reason a lot of them did not want to stay is they assumed there would probably be no Catholic church in British Florida at which they could worship, and they wanted to go. They wanted, of course, religion always being a very prominent part of Spanish cultural life at that time. So in 1763 and 1764, the Spanish and the remnant mission villagers sailed to Cuba. The reports at that time say that there were 84 Indians that left with the Spanish. Think how many that is, from all the ones that were there. But what they did was, as I've done my research, the 84 were the people that came out of the mission villages. There were other Indians living in St. Augustine, in town, not in the mission villages, who had so assimilated into the town that they were really not identified as Indians anymore. And so they didn't count them as Indians when they took them to Cuba. And there's some very interesting records in Cuba actually about these Indians. They had, as I said, they had moved into St. Augustine and lived in houses right among the Spanish residents. One of the Indians who I've studied a lot was a chief named, or his Spanish name was Francisco Hospogue. He grew up at the mission, probably on St. Catherine's. Probably was born in the middle of the 1660s. It's a fascinating family. We're actually able to follow an Indian family, although not just the same person, for a century, from the 1660s to the 1760s. Grew up, as I said, in St. Catherine's or Santa Catalina Mission, or very close by, on the coast of Georgia. And as the Indians, allied with the Carolinians, start to attack, they attack at his village, and he and his other members of his village start to retreat towards St. Augustine. They go down the coast, end up at Amelia Island, and of course end up in St. Augustine. Chief Francisco Hospogue becomes a leader. He is appointed, he gets an appointment from the Spanish governor in the 1690s. And I know all this because when he's old, he writes a petition to the King of Spain because he wants a pension for all the sacrifices that he says he's made. A pension for him and for his family after he dies. puts that in there. He talks about how he taught the men who followed him, how he taught them to fire guns, how his first family, how he lost his first family when the English Indians took them at knife point in his village because he was out fighting. And so he moves closer to St. Augustine as the English push harder, contracts around St. Augustine, marries again, and moves into town. His house was right at the end of a little street in St. Augustine called Fort Alley, and he could have looked right down the street at one of the towers of the Castillo de San Marcos. Or if he were there today, he could listen to the band at the Milltop Bar. But I can show you where his house was within probably about 10 or 15 feet. Of course, I don't know if they've ever found it archaeologically. There's no evidence of it. There's a little drawing on that. He marries for a second time, as I said, and his widow is one of the people that moves to Cuba in 1763. So we've been able to follow this family for 100 years, which is really unusual to be able to do for a Native American family at this time. But for the most part, the Timucua, the Appalachee, the Wally of the Georgia coast did not remain in Florida in the southeast in any recognizable group. There are people that claim they are descendants of the Timucua, but the group itself had been pretty well disbanded. How many of you have heard about the Appalachian group in Louisiana? You have. A group of the Indians, or the Mission Indians, who fled San Luis de Apalache, near present-day Tallahassee, fled west to Mobile into French, at that time French territory, and they have been able, because they fled to the French, they remained Catholic. They have been able to trace their ancestry through the Catholic records over all these years. They, for a number of years, really sort of lived way out in the swamps in Louisiana. But over the past few years, I would say the past 10 or 12 years, they've really come to the fore. They've identified themselves as the descendants of the Appalachee. And last I heard, they were trying to get recognized as a federal tribe. So there were some of them that were left. When the Indians leave St. Augustine and Pensacola in 1763, as the British come in, we will not see Indians living among the people in either of those towns again. We will not see them incorporated into the society as the Spanish did. So in 1763, Great Britain takes over Florida. In fact, you can see from this map, Great Britain takes over the whole Atlantic coast. You really have to look at the map to see that Great Britain held everything from up there at Nova Scotia down to the tip of Florida. And then, of course, Louisiana over there goes under Spanish control. So everybody was swapping territory. The French are pretty well off of the continent right now. What this does for the Native Americans, not just in Florida, but throughout, but especially in the southeast, where they had played Spanish allied Indians and French allied Indians and British allied Indians off against each other, they've now got basically this monolith to deal with. How do you play the nations off against each other when you've got one nation pretty much controlling the entire North American coast? It becomes more difficult, and so the negotiations that the Native Americans, certainly in the southeast, have to make are changed. But Great Britain approaches it differently than the Spanish did as well. One of the things that the British Board of Trade did right away in 1763 was to issue what they called the Proclamation of 1763. That was a long proclamation about how settlement and other things were supposed to be handled in the British colonies in North America. You can see the purple there that shows the 13 original colonies. The boundaries of those pretty much match what was called the Proclamation Line. Because in 1763, Great Britain said the whites are to stay east of this line, between the line and the ocean, and the territory to the west was to be reserved for the Indians. They wanted to try to keep their problems at bay. They also were trying to protect the deerskin trade. It was not, it's seldom all about humanitarian ideas. There's usually a heavy economic idea involved here as well. Don't mean to be cynical, but that's just true. In light of that, when Governor James Grant arrives in Florida, or East Florida, because the British split Spanish Florida into East Florida and West Florida with the dividing line at the Apalachicola River. Governor Grant holds a meeting, or a Congress as they call it, on the banks of the St. Johns River. Is it too loud? Okay. He holds a Congress on the east bank of the St. Johns River at what was the old landing to go, the Mission Trail to the west, a place called Piccolata. And that was where everybody had crossed the river in the past. And so he has his meeting there. A number of Creek chiefs come to the meeting, and they come to some agreement. Cowkeeper won't come to the meeting with the other Creek chiefs. He insists on having his own separate meeting, and he meets with them a month later in December of 1765. He is showing his independence that he's not going to meet with the rest of the Creek chiefs. And one of the things that they agree to, the Creek chiefs that are there and the British officials, is, if you can see this here, this line here and that line goes all the way up to the St. Mary's River, which of course is today the state line for Florida. It's similar to that proclamation line. In other words, to the east of that line and to the north of that line is where the whites can settle. To the west is to be Indian territory, and to the south is to be Indian territory. The boundary ran approximately 35 miles inland from the coast, from the St. Mary's to just south of Spalding's Lower Store. As I said, the Indians would stay to the west and the St. John's. The British wanted, and part of this is they don't want the Indians interfering with their plans too, because their plan, of course, was to create, and they certainly did it on paper, and a lot of it actually on the ground too, to create a lot of plantations in Florida, just as they had done in South Carolina and other places, especially to grow indigo and to grow rice. And so for the rice, they definitely wanted access to the tidal creeks and to the rivers, and so that's the area they reserved for themselves. What this did for the Native Americans was actually sort of enhance their coalescing and joining together, because now they were sort of over in their own area. And there were trading stores set up as part of this agreement. There were trading stores on the tributary of the St. Mary's River called Saunders Store, way up at today's state line. Spalding's Lower Store on the St. John's, which was just north of the Ocklawaha River. And then there was another, what they called the Upper Store, which was about 5 miles further south. Remember that the St. John's flows south, and so the Lower Store is the one closer to the mouth of the river. We always have to think about that, because I think north being upper and south being lower, but it doesn't work quite that way with the St. John's. These trading stores were where the Native Americans brought in their goods to sell in exchange, largely deerskins, in exchange for the manufactured goods that the British brought. As I mentioned before, they particularly liked sharp tools, things that they could manufacture for themselves. Mirrors, razors, scissors, thimbles, axes, things with sharp edges were particularly important. Cloth, you see a lot of cloth among the things that are brought into the store. And they brought it into the store, and they kept accounting books. It's almost like that idea of the company store. I don't know there's any money that ever changes hands. There's goods that change hands. And they kept the accounting in chalks, C-H-A-L-K, just like chalk that you write on a border on the sidewalk. And there were 4 chalks, basically, when I say to the dollar. That doesn't quite work with the British, but I'm going to go ahead and say that there were 4 chalks to the dollar. This is a page from one of those trading store books, telling what they bought and how many. If you can see right up there in the top right-hand corner, it says chalks. And then they're listed underneath there and what they bought. It's a little hard, I think, to read from this, but on the 4th line down, I can easily read, it says tobacco. If you put 11 lines down, there's some tin pans, bars of lead. I transcribed this a while back, but I didn't bring it with me further on down there. I think there's some kettles. Anyway, they brought in something that was worth 1,600 chalks, and their bill came to 1,561, so they still had a credit of 39 chalks that I guess that would carry over till the next time that they brought some goods in. Pardon?
It's the first credit card.
Well, yeah, but a lot of it was done. It was done on credit, but I mean, but it wasn't barter where you said, well, you take this and I'll take this. It was much more set out, and this has a value and that has a value. So it was really, it was book. They were keeping books actually, and book credit.
What year was the previous map? The previous map you have there on the previous?
The previous map was from 1763. Well, I mean, the map was drawn recently, but it's a map to portray at 1763. And of course, it was the Creeks, or the people that are starting to call themselves Seminoles. This is just about that time period, that are bringing the things into Spalding's store, especially the two stores on the St. Johns River. Some of you may remember about, let's see, 7 years ago, the Okahumpka Museum at Big Cypress Reservation in South Florida acquired an original of the February 1774 letter from John Moultrie, who at that time was the acting governor of British East Florida. This is the letter that he wrote. The important thing about this letter is that on the envelope, and this is this part over here where it would have been folded. It's not an envelope as we think of this, it folded it over. It said, Moultrie addresses it to Cowkeeper, the founder of the Seminole tribe of Florida. This seems to be the first date, or the first known use of the recognition of the term Seminole as a separate group by the British in this case, by somebody from the outside, recognizing them as a separate nation. And so this is very important. Now it's interesting because at the top of this letter, he actually says to Cowkeeper, the head something warrior of the Creek Nation. And then he calls him the founder of the Seminole Nation on the envelope. But the British didn't stay in Florida for long. They were only here for about 20 years. While they were in Florida, of course, the American Revolution broke out. And the Spanish declared war against Great Britain during the American Revolution. They did not come in as allies of the U.S., but they were fighting against Great Britain at the same time. And this time they were on the winning side, unlike they were 20 years earlier. And so Great Britain had to give up, of course, its North America, its holdings in the U.S., which included the British colonies of East Florida and West Florida. And they are returned to the Spanish. So the Spanish take control of East Florida after the American Revolution in 1784. And now, the St. Mary's, which we were just looking at a minute or two ago and talking about the store on there, is now an international boundary. It is the boundary between Spanish Florida and the U.S., or Spanish Florida and American Georgia. It's kind of hard to think of it that way today. It was an international boundary. You were stopped at the border when you came in. You had to have a passport, or at least a pass to come in. It was treated as an international boundary. It's also not a very wide river. It was very often hard to control people going across the river. And I always liked that one Spanish officer wrote, just about the time the Spanish came back, he said, and on the King's Highway, it is only a pistol shot in width across the river. And I thought, well, we know that was a well tested. We know there was a lot of testing as to how wide that river was, because there were probably a lot of pistols shot across that river. So it is the international boundary. The U.S., of course, or the 13 states, have just, of course, been successful during the American Revolution. And if you'll recall from your U.S. history, that at first there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of uncertainty as to how these 13 former colonies are going to work together. They become, of course, the Confederation at first. And so many of them think they're going to be much more independent than they are. A number of them are not so keen on, being under so much control of the national government. I'm not sure this is something we've resolved yet, 200 and some odd years later, but it was very obvious at the time. And as you can imagine, for more than one reason, one of the states that was one of the biggest proponents of being able to act independently was the state of Georgia. Georgia basically didn't intend to adhere to anything President Washington said for New York City, which was the capital at the time. And it's also probably the state that is the farthest in distance from the capital. So, you know, this time, certainly, even today, but certainly this time, distance, the further you are away, the easier it is to be a little more independent. And to, there's many instances where they basically thumb their nose at Washington and say, well, come down here and make us do it. It wasn't quite that crass, but that's pretty much what I'm saying. But it's a problem for the Native Americans in the area and the Spanish government. We now have multiple groups that are all trying to be in control of their own fate and all thinking of themselves rather as independent nations. We just talked about how the governor had recognized Cowkeeper as the founder of the Seminole Nation. There's a lot of Creek Indians that have moved down to that Georgia-Florida border. They've been displaced by white settlement in the state of Georgia, and so they've pushed south and they've come down close to the St. Mary's, and they're operating rather independently themselves. In addition, the state of Georgia, as I said this afternoon, it's making its own Indian treaties for lands. So it's like, we'll take over this much land from you and you can move further west. And so there's, it's not really every man for himself, but there is a lot of that going on. Spain, when they come in, continues pretty much the policies that the British had with the Indians in Florida. They keep that line that I showed you, that this side will be Indian territory, this side, the east side, will be for white settlement. The Spanish, when they returned to Florida in 1784, also do not establish the missions again. They talk about it, but they don't set up the missions during what's generally called the Second Spanish period. It's interesting because this is the heyday of mission organization in California. They aren't just creating missions one after another in California at this time, but they don't do it in Florida. And so, as I said, you've got the Creeks kind of moving back and forth across that international boundary of the St. Mary's. Probably the people that are the least disturbed for a while really are the Seminoles, because they're further down into the Florida Peninsula. They're not as close to that international boundary where there's so much contention going on. The Spanish Governor Cespedes, knew that he had to somehow keep peace with the Seminoles, though. He certainly knew he didn't have enough troops to hold them off, and he needed their support, or at least certainly wanted to keep them from not changing allegiance should he have problems with any other European nation. And there's a European nation that may have been removed physically from the continent, but they're right over in the Bahamas ready to come right back in, and that's Great Britain. There's a lot of people who were very highly placed during the British period and just before the Revolution in the U.S. They were in the Bahamas, and they've got a really good idea. They said, we don't need the territory. If we can just control the trade, we've got the best of both worlds. We'll have the money, but we don't have to protect the territory. And so they're always coming up with all these schemes as to how to get into the trade in Florida, but also over in Alabama, Mississippi, and over to the state of Mississippi, and over to the Mississippi River. So Governor Cespedes, just like the British governor 20 years before, has some talks with the Indians. He has a Congress as well. They don't meet out at the river, though. They actually meet in St. Augustine. And Cespedes' problem is he doesn't have as many gifts to give the Indians as the British did. He doesn't have access to the manufactured goods like the British did. So he has to keep telling, they come to St. Augustine, he says, well, you know, I haven't been here for very long, and the gifts haven't had a chance to arrive. He tells them that in September. Then he tells them the same story again in December. Well, by December, they're getting, they're wondering when these gifts are going to come in, because you told us that 3 months ago, and you still don't have anything for us, which was the truth. Now, one of the individuals here that I want to talk about that probably hardly ever makes it into the history book is a man named James Allen, or, since I was reading the Spanish documents, Diego Allen, because they like to give him a Spanish first name and then use whatever their last name was. Diego Allen is a man who created a lot of trouble along the Georgia-Florida border, between everybody. He's an Indian trader who lives on what they call the upperest part of the river, that means way upriver. And he's supposed to be working for the official trading company. the Pan-Western Company. But he's in this isolated location. The Creeks like him being there, and he deals in goods and property that comes from anyone with little care about how they might acquire the items. He doesn't care if they've stolen them or not. He was known to few whites at the time, and as I said, has mostly disappeared from history. But he had the support of the Creeks in this area, very southern Georgia, and with Indian assent or consent, as I said, lived near or maybe within Indian claim land. His location was almost out of reach of all the officials, and the Indians would run interference for him when needed. Allen was often the destination, as I mentioned, for stolen property, especially horses and cattle, which were very valuable at this time, and of course very easy to move. Some of the Creek leaders, in fact, aided and defended Allen. When he defied the order of the Justice of the Peace for the St. Mary's River, the Creeks wrote to the governor, the Justice of the Peace writes, he breaks the law every day by selling horses and cattle to a man who then ships them to Cumberland Island, Georgia. When the Spanish officials tried to remove Allen from Florida, he refused to comply, and Allen's Creek's friends came to his defense. In fact, they write a letter to the Spanish governor saying they don't want Allen removed. That's after the. This is one of the letters written to the governor. This is actually written in English, and then would have had to be translated before the Spanish governor got it. And one of the letters is signed by Chief Jack Kennard. He complains that, in fact, that the Justice of the Peace, Richard Lang, has stolen some of Allen's property, some that he has bought from the people of this land, meaning the Indians. And he says, quote, the chiefs of the town, is what he calls them, told the Spanish that it was the chiefs of the town that gave Allen the privilege to settle there and want to know why he cannot stay there in peace. He has been a good friend to us, and he supplies us with our needs. The chiefs did not want anybody else settling in there if they removed Allen. After Allen was taken into custody, there were even more letters written. And the chief writes, it is not me alone that he is a friend to, but every trader and Indian in my land. If he is not set at liberty, I shall think that you look upon me as a nobody. This is my talk. What I like is the fact that here we have the Creek leader writing to Governor Cespedes saying we really want this trader to stay here. But from another perspective, we get to see what their signatures and their brands look like. Because here's the signature of one, here's another, and here's another down here where their brands. And they have been the same symbol that they used actually to brand their cattle and horses. That's very possible. Those are not particularly intricate. And there's that same one again. Here's the big K. You can see the K up here for Jack Kennard, who was one of the chiefs that was talking to them as well. The governor was kind of in a fix. He was having trouble saving face because really he only, all he could rattle was a verbal sword. He really couldn't do much more than that. So he kind of just lets things go with the lower creeks up there along the St. Mary's River, straddling the Georgia-Florida line. But he's able to make a bigger show of force to the Seminoles. And remember, he wants to keep the Seminoles on his side. In fact, to make the show of force, he overstepped his authority as governor of Florida, took a trial and punishment into his hands, which was not within his authority. It should have gone to Havana, which was where his superior was to be taken care of. In fact, Cespedes, for the most part, was not to try capital crimes, and certainly not to carry them out. But what happens is that you've got a man in St. Augustine, who's actually a convict laborer serving out a sentence there, named Lorenzo Barreto. And he kills one Seminole, and he wounds another. The Seminoles want satisfaction for the murder, and they want it fast. And so Cespedes writes in his report, we don't know what happened, that Barreto confessed. The governor quickly convened a tribunal in St. Augustine and condemned Barreto to death. Should have gone to Havana for that to happen. The prisoner was executed quickly. In fact, I'm not sure, they may have garroted him. They couldn't find a hangman, so they had to find some other method. Cespedes wanted to adhere to the idea of, at that time it was Seminole justice. In other words, they didn't think it was justice if it was carried out where they couldn't see it and where they didn't know that it happened. So the idea of the state giving out justice like that, like we see it, so to send him to Havana, even if they reported later that he may have been, executed for killing a Seminole Indian, would not have pacified the Seminoles nearly as much as actually being able to witness it or talking to someone who witnessed it. And so, now I'm reading a little of this in there. I mean, Cespedes doesn't say, I'm overstepping my authority so I can keep peace. He doesn't write that, but I think that's what's going on in the context of it all. He was threatened by the Georgians, by the Border Creeks. He could not afford to lose the support of the Seminoles. Some of this upset contention settles down a little in 1790 when the U.S. signs the very first treaty it ever signs. And the first treaty that it signs is with the Creek Nation, not with another, as the new United States. In 1790, they signed what was called the Treaty of New York, and it deals with how Indian lands will be distributed. And at that point, and of course, it negates any of the treaties that Georgia might have been on some or anyone else, and it helps some with the problem. One of the other things that the Spanish Florida government needed the Seminoles for, not just to keep them happy, to keep peace, was to help to feed them. The Seminoles provided beef to feed the soldiers and very often the people of the town as well, from their herds that grazed largely on the Alachua Prairie. I think it's rather ironic that they sold their herds, they sold cattle from their herds to the Spanish, mostly to feed the soldiers as part of the military budget, to the very soldiers that if they got into an argument, would be the ones that would have to be fighting against them. So it's kind of an interesting thing. But on the other hand, it's interesting that I think that there's a money trail that starts in Veracruz, Mexico, which is where the money was coming to feed the soldiers, and ends up in the Alachua Prairie, whether it's on paper or whether it's actually in cash or not. The Seminoles, in fact, are selling cattle to a lot of people. They are driving them across the border into Georgia to sell them to individuals up there. And sometimes if they can't make deals with the Spanish, they'd be happy to sell them to the U.S. troops. As we know in the future, and even more irony that the Seminoles would sell beef to feed, perhaps, the U.S. troops. For the most part, the people that negotiated these deals with the Seminoles were free blacks and free mulattoes. They rode to Seminole country, and I'm talking about largely in the area of Alachua, Payne's Prairie, to negotiate for the cattle case. And there's some interesting documents that are generated by this, because failure to pay the Seminole cattle traders or to pay the Seminoles themselves resulted in fights and court cases that have survived in the records. And we see the Seminole women being prominent in this cattle trading as well. There is a case in St. Augustine in the early 1800s where Bowleg's sister, her name is Semensi, comes to town to testify that the Seminoles, or one of the traders, is owed money that he has not been paid. And there's even a woman who actually files a case. There's actually kind of a funny case too. There is a free black named Felipe Edinburgh, and he hasn't been paid so that he can pay the Seminoles. And he goes to the person who's sort of like the interim treasurer for the Spanish in St. Augustine, and they get into a big fight. And he says he wants to be paid, he demands to be paid. And the treasurer actually grabs a cow horn and goes after him with it as a weapon. But they're arguing over paying for cattle, so I thought it was rather interesting. But one of the cases that was filed for payment was for lack of paying for this cattle was filed while Florida was still Spanish in 1808, and lingers on until Florida becomes American and shows up in the U.S. court cases, or actually the local court cases, in the records in St. Augustine in 1825. The case has been going on for that long. It is filed by Payne's sister, Chief Payne's sister, Buckra woman, sometimes also known as Beaver. And the debt is first expressed in chalks. It shows up, and this actually the organization that I had, the San Rosa Historical Society, cares for the earliest court cases of our county. And of course, St. Johns County, which is where St. Augustine is, was the whole peninsula when Florida was first formed. So I actually pulled this out of the court case the other day and scanned it. It actually looks a lot better scanned than it did when I put it on there. And it's but I brought this down. It's once again it's older stuff. But down here, if you can look at it, they have to reproduce the promissory note from 1808. Cattle's purchased in 1804. They pay for like about a third of it, and then they continue to owe the other 2/3. And it talks about how many chalks. It was a purchase of around 6,800 chalks to begin with. And they pay some, and then they continue to owe around 4,300. I don't know what the chalks down there are on this side, because it's just a bunch of zeros. It might have been some fee for the court clerk to make a recording of it or something like that. But they're still expressing it in both U.S. dollars by this time, and also in chalks. There's a not here read at the top. About the fourth line down, it says Buckerwoman versus Philip R. Young. Actually a member of the P.K. Young family of the Library of Florida History. So Buckerwoman filed suit while the Spanish were still in Florida in 1808. By 1825, she's just moved that suit over into the American period. But under the U.S., Buckerwoman can't appear in court on her own. She is now a ward of the Indian agent, at least legally. So she filed the suit on her own when the Spanish were there, but the Americans required that the Indian agent represent people in court at this time. And the suit goes through as to who is, that she's, the Gad Humphreys, who is the Indian agent, is representing her in this. I wanted to show this to you because this is really this is the Seminoles coming in and saying, we want to be paid. We're using your justice system. And we've got it, we've told you how many chalks we sold you and how many chalks you owe us, but we also know how many dollars you owe us. And that was a lot of money at that time, a lot of money. 68, you can do the math, divide 6,800 by 4. What, about $1,500 originally? That's a lot of money to them. That was a lot of money in 1808 and in 1825. Before the official transfer of Florida in 1821 to the United States, as many of you know, Andrew Jackson attempted to speed up the process of acquisition to the U.S. by invading Spanish West Florida. He, of course, used at least the guise, said he was chasing Seminoles. I'm not saying he wasn't, but he really wanted to take over the entire province and wanted to see how far he could get in. In fact, he even made the comment, there's no reason to stop now. We might as well go ahead and take Cuba while we're at it. This didn't, of course, Washington has a way of slowing everybody down. It's like, oh, we're not so sure this is going to play so well with the Spanish, so maybe you just need to come back and do one. But in and that's usually known as the First Seminole War. The invasion, of course, initiated an ultimate relocation on the part of the Seminoles that were in this path. The Red Stick Creeks dropped south into the area of Tampa Bay, and the Alachua Indians began moving south, where their principal town became Okahumpka in Lake County. This is a map of the Civil War in 1836, and let's see, right up here, you're not going to look at it on the screen, but this is so is Okahumpka. The two A's are an I and Y. But there it is in Lake County, and it's literally on the map. The Spanish, of course, a number of them leave Florida when Florida is transferred to the United States in 1821. Not nearly the big evacuation like there was when they left the first time, because a lot of them continue to stay. A lot of the people that were in Florida by the time that Florida was transferred to the United States were of Anglo descent. A lot of them had moved in from Georgia and from South Carolina. They had moved in under the Spanish times. They'd taken Spanish names or their Spanish first names. I love looking through and seeing, like here in O'Reilly. And there's other, and then there's sometimes, it's interesting sometimes to see the Spanish officials trying to write an Irish name. So they do some interesting, they do some rather creative things with it. But in 1821, the U.S. takes over Florida, both Floridas, in July of that year. The Spanish leave, and then of course, as we all know, and I am not an expert on the Seminole Wars, and I know that, the things once again really change for the Indians of Florida once the United States is in, and the Americans in the South see that the Florida land is now open for making theirs and for making farms. And I will leave you there with the people having moved to Okahumpka, close by. Thank you.